Hello everybody, it's Michael Hollands. I would love to welcome each and every one of you to the Score Insider podcast. Today I am joined by my friend and the super talented composer Ashton.
Thank you so much, Michael, and welcome everyone to the new Score Insider podcast. This is a podcast just aimed at film music as a whole. I came across Michael a few months ago from his Sound of the Movies interview series on YouTube, and I could tell that he, like myself, is incredibly enthusiastic about film music, so I thought that this would be a fun opportunity to just explore our passion and love for film music and just talk a bit about the things that make it up in terms of the composers that are involved in it, the various scores, and this will be an opportunity just to dive in by looking at the evolution of it all. So I'm looking forward to it.
And like you just mentioned, there is so much to talk about. There are so many different eras throughout the history of film music, from the silent era to the golden age, the big scores, the 50s, the 60s, then another big step in the 70s and also the 80s. There has been so much development, not only in terms of, let's say, composition, but also in terms of sound. We are here to discuss certain or many aspects of the whole industry, so to speak.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, you're completely right when you're talking about not only musically have things just taken an incredibly interesting journey, especially when looking at the start of everything as we see it now, which can be looked at sort of starting with King Kong by Max Steiner in 1933, and looking at the evolution from that point to where we are now, and there's the different sort of phases we've gone through and the way that musically composition has changed, but also in terms of the sonic palette and the way that, you know, synthesizers were introduced and composers ended up going out and experimenting and pushing the boundaries of the craft as a whole. I think there's so much to look at and so much incredible innovation. So I think it'd be fun to maybe start out with like before the 1930s, so before film music as we know it with talking picture sort of began. So first of all, what are your sort of thoughts, and what do you think about the whole entire silent era?
I would have to be completely honest and tell you that I have never really fully warmed up to the silent era. But there is still something special about that era, because, of course, film started to grow from there. And music back then was featured so prominently in the movies. I mean, of course, it is still today, and it always has been.
Yeah.
But back then, as of course the name tells you, the silent era, there was no dialogue. It was only picture.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is initially music sort of had these two different jobs. I mean, the first job was, of course, just adding depth to the two-dimensional images, but the sort of second thing that it really occupied in terms of its function is, of course, covering up the noise from these projectors, which were incredibly loud and incredibly intrusive. And when you had a organ player or a pianist or a string section, it automatically brought things to life, but it also was just really, really convenient for the various theaters around the country, or around the world, really, because it, you know, eradicated the awful sound of the projector. So yeah, it just has these two different really important roles.
Absolutely. And the music was so very different back then. I mean, of course, it's underscored a film or a sequence, but the way it was composed and presented to an audience was so much different to what it is today, or so much different to, let's say, 10 years later, starting from the silent era and then to the golden age. So there was already a big evolution. And of course, if you were to present a silent movie to a audience today, or to a younger audience, I don't think they could, entirely deal with that, because it was a whole different.
That's incredibly true. And I think it's almost like a language. I mean, really, when you go back past a certain point, film, and I mean, if you look at the English language, if you go back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, things just start getting very unrecognizable from, somebody who speaks English fluently. And I think that it's the exact same in film, especially when you look at the silent era, is that people had completely different perceptions of the world at that time. And those films, when you watch them, are just perceived in a different way. The way that they utilize text, the way in which the comedy is presented is a bit different to how we react to comedy nowadays. The whole entire experience as a whole was different. And I think what you were talking about in terms of just the technical aspect of, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this too, but just the difference between now we have music synced up to picture, but at that time it was all live performance. You had organ players or pianists playing, cues, in these little booths behind the screen. So, I mean, what are your thoughts in terms of just the way in which the music was actually presented to the audiences?
I think it was incredibly, or it must have been incredibly difficult to really synchronize everything. And I also, it was a couple of years back when I watched a TV show in which they had a pianist and the composer, and they just showed a silent movie just for 2 or 3 minutes, and then he completely improvised on the piano an entire piece of music and put it up against the picture. It wasn't a piece of music which had been written previously or prior to that point, but he improvised, and that was incredibly not only inspiring but also impressive. How everything started back then is just a milestone.
And I think that, going off what you were talking about too, in terms of just specific names or specific events during this period before the 1930s, when film music as we know it with, composers such as Steiner sort of, began our modern understanding of film music, you have to look at like Charlie Chaplin, for example, who not only was an actor and a director, but also wrote the music for his films. And that was sort of ragtime, which is still sort of like a very nostalgic, very, whenever we think of silent movies, usually we're going to be thinking of ragtime. Because that was sort of like the drama. Like you could use it for comedy, you could use it for any sort of emotion during these silent movies. And it was a very sort of versatile form of music. Even as early as 1895, the Lumiere brothers had their first film screening where they were joined by a pianist. So it's been something that's been around for so long, but those are just a couple events that I think really stick out.
Absolutely. And it was a great transition on your part as well. You mentioned Max Steiner, a composer who many consider to be the father of film music.
Mm-hmm.
And also King Kong, one of his very best scores, and also very historic, very important, also due to his extensive use of leitmotifs in that score. And Max Steiner will always be synonymous with the history and the success of film music, and also it, in Vienna, Hollywood in Vienna, the Max Steiner Awards, and also it goes to show how important he was for the history of film music, and he was kind of the one that really, let's say, almost revolutionized the music for that era. And of course there are many great composers that worked in that era, also like Erich Wolfgang Korngold, The Adventures of Robin Hood and the Seahawk, which was also an influence on John Williams many years later. And we had Alfred Newman.
As you were saying, I mean, huge period for film scoring, and especially because it was the invention of talking pictures as we know it, where actors can now, instead of just using their bodies and using their faces to perform, they used their voices, and it became a different way of telling stories, and therefore the music was functioning differently and had a different sort of feel. And, up to this point, we'd seen a lot of traditions where they were using classical music compiled with compiled with film. So this was sort of giving way to completely new, original composed scores, like Max Steiner, and as you were saying, Alfred Newman. And it really dawned with the score of King Kong in 1933, which is just still this classic, really the father, as you were saying, of film music. And it's inspired endless amounts of composers throughout history. And I think another thing to mention about the 1930s is those really early sort of musicals that were very prevalent and was really the dawn of going into the 1960s and 70s with a lot of those classic musicals. You had things like Wizard of Oz, which was very revolutionary. And it has a very 30s orchestration feel. And I think that stands as a pretty prime example of the way in which music was sort of heading into. And that's just my thought on the 30s.
There are also composers that fully, let's say, put their imprint on the film music just as much as the Newmans and the Korngolds. And one of those people was Bernard Herrmann. And he then created so much amazing music, not also in terms of composition, but also in terms of sound. And of course, his collaboration with director Alfred Hitchcock was so historic and so important to the history of film. And when you look at Hitchcock's movies, when he started out, when he used Bernard Herrmann's score, it was so intense, and those two work together so well. And nowadays we have so many great director composer collaborations, but back then it was really, to me, it was Bernard Herrmann and Alfred Hitchcock.
And I think especially looking back at those eras, at these very early eras of film scoring, even going back to the early days of Steven Spielberg and John Williams and how they still tend to do it now, is that there was this otherworldly sense of trust, because in these cases you were arriving at the scoring stage and these directors were hearing the scores as they were for the absolute first time. So there was this whole other collaborative process that I think is very different, not better, maybe not worse than what we have now, but it was just a completely different feel. So as you were saying, Bernard Herrmann and Alfred Hitchcock, there was this level of trust and experimentation and willingness to travel into the most uncharted territories, especially with stuff like Psycho and Vertigo and North by Northwest. There was just so much amazing stuff. And this sort of dawns us into the 1940s, which actually did really break a large amount of barriers in terms of creating music that richly enhanced the films that were being made. If you look at Casablanca by Max Steiner, which is one of the best films of all time. Citizen Kane by Bernard Herrmann, one of the greatest films of all time. It's a Wonderful Life. There is a lot of pristine, brilliant films in the 1940s. And I think, in my personal opinion, at the onset of the war especially, it brought about this other perspective in film. It brought about, there was so much turmoil and there was so much happening in the world at that time, so much destructive things happening, that people really did tend to turn to film to create this, I wouldn't say distraction, because there was no way to distract from what was happening in the world, but I think that it was a very creative point in the history of film, and that was sort of replicated or duplicated in the form of film music and art as a whole.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. It was a very important time back then. And you mentioned the level of trust which was established between directors and composers back then, because, as you also pointed out, back in the day you heard the score or the full score not until it was presented in the recording session or during the session, which is of course totally different to than it is now. And you just talk to a director and you play the cues on the piano, and then you kind of try to emphasize what the full score would sound like. But it must have been pretty difficult to fully understand, for a director to fully understand what the composer's vision was.
That's incredibly true. I mean, there was, I think that as composers and directors started to work together more commonly, especially if you look at like a Spielberg-John Williams relationship, it's that over time the director did get more of an understanding in terms of what it was going to sound like. I mean, even if you look at that legendary video of Steven Spielberg and John Williams, sitting at the piano, working on a sequence from E.T., is that you could tell when you look at Spielberg, like he understands how things are functioning, because they have that level of understanding and that level of trust. So I think it's something that you also get with time as well. But in the modern era, when every single second of film is not only heard by the studios before it's actually recorded, so there's this endless all the way up until like the week of the recording session where we're constantly conforming to hit every single moment. And I think that at this period in history, the music was very expansive, and it was very beautiful and textural and soaring and just pristine. And there was so much, the composers could say so much. And I think that over history, as technology is introduced, that necessarily hasn't gone away, and it hasn't gotten worse, I wouldn't say, but it definitely has changed from how it was, in the 40s, as we were discussing.
Very true. And let's go from the 40s to the 1950s, a period of time in which film music branched out a little bit more, and you had prominent names such as Alex North, who back then scored A Streetcar Named Desire.
Ben-Hur, of course. Brilliant.
Absolutely. And also composers like Dmitri Tiomkin.
Mm-hmm.
And he scored back then the film High Noon, a film which I've seen many times. And also very important in that movie, he used a song called Oh My Darling, which was used for, of course, promotional purposes. And back then, I think you could see the trend going into maybe a different direction. They understood that you also sometimes need to have, of course, not only a score but also a song in order to propel the movie, or let's say introduce a movie to an audience a little bit differently.
But there's a lot of ending credit songs that I think the trend sort of has gone down a bit, but you still have songs like with Elite to Battle Angel. There's that big song that was released for that movie. I think that there's a lot that you can do with songs nowadays associated with movies, because it's a great way of introducing the audience to that world of the film and giving them something to walk away with.
Very true. But that sometimes it takes away from the quality of the score. I mean, in terms of mainstream audience, because sometimes on many occasions the mainstream audience, I believe, seems to connect more with a song than they do with a score. I mean, I've had that several times, and as you probably know, you mentioned Celine Dion, Titanic. Most people, in terms of music, associate this film with the Celine Dion song, and sometimes they say, well, we don't know who James Horner was, and they associate this particular film with this song.
There's something, I guess, to be gained from songs, like, for sure, and I see why the studios do it, is because there is certainly an aspect that is, when you have a popular artist associated with a movie, it's going to have a sense of gravity to it. But yeah, I mean, I think in the case of, I'm sort of a stickler because I like that song. I like the Celine Dion. And I think that, I actually think that it does a pretty damn good job of describing that movie and describing the story of that movie. But I can totally see how, it might get some people off to the wrong foot because of its detraction of, as you were saying, attention from the composer. But I think both have their place, really.
I mean, it's probably a point, or we could probably drag this conversation forever about songs versus score, But the point, of course, I wanted to bring across was that many people just simply, of course, associate this film or this, let's say, they associate the song with the film, and then they say, well, of course, Celine Dion wrote the music to the entire movie, and then they just don't realize that there was 2 hours of score in that film.
Well, there's more than that, actually. I mean, there's a lot. There's a 4-hour collection that was released recently of music recorded for that movie. I mean, in that specific case, there was an amount of music recorded which included a lot of the songs that they used, like the string quartet music that was recorded for those sequences. But yeah, there was at least, I think, 3 hours plus music written for Titanic, because, man, that thing is a beast. But also, 1950s, jazz. People started to introduce jazz into film scores, which was, not really utilized in the 1940s, and it was really on its onset. And this was one of the first moments, I think, in film music history where people started saying, hey, we can take music that's different from our average orchestral music and try to see how it works with visuals. And going into the 1960s, we especially saw that, with rock and roll being introduced in film scores. But in the 1950s, I always think of, Vertigo by Bernard Herrmann. I think of Ben-Hur. Of course, I think of On the Waterfront. And, that really, again, led our way into the 1960s. What are your thoughts on the 60s going into that era?
Well, you just mentioned the jazz components, and Miles Davis, of course, was one of the people that kind of brought jazz into film scoring, the elevator to the gallows, which was also improvised to picture largely, and it's a very, very interesting score, and of course an important movie. And I think jazz is still, or has been prominent, or has been used prominently in film scores. I mean, just like the Russia House, for instance, some jazz elements in there, and also some very great other scores. So you could use you can still feel the influence today. But of course, after the 50s, or during the 50s, and then the 60s, you had the big Western scores. I mean, people like Elmer Bernstein, he wrote this incredibly popular score for the Magnificent Seven, Ennio Morricone, and the Sergio Leone collaboration, the Dollar trilogy, and Once Upon a Time in the West. So it was huge, and it allowed so many composers to bring their A game. People like Henry Mancini, the Pink Panther, or Lalo Schifrin, John Barry, and the James Bond scores. And let's not forget Maurice Jarre, who wrote this incredibly effective score for Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah, and Maurice Jarre would go on to become one of Alexandre Desplat's big sort of role models, of course, with him being French as well.
It was such a great period of time. One of the movies that changed the course, in my book, or in many people's book, was The Graduate. This movie relied a lot on songs, and they licensed lots of songs for this film, and they had the Simon and Garfunkel song in the movie, Miss Robinson, and also used during one of the key scenes of the film at the end. So that really changed a lot.
You can always really see a reflection in art of what's happening in the world at the time, like we were talking about the 1940s with the Second World War. In the 1960s was this massive explosion onset of rock and roll. I mean, you had this really big rock and roll revolution with bands like, for example, the Rolling Stones coming out. So I think it was part of that attitude that really helped to onset this newfound sense of experimentation. And we were really heading into different territory. And I think that that really leads us into the 1970s when we start to introduce synthesizers, because that would become part of the dawn of the next era of film scoring. But yeah, the 1960s cannot be overstated how important I think it was, and how many great names and great scores I think really inhabit that period for sure. The 1970s is interesting because it was definitely a continuation of this, again, the sense of experimentation, and we saw the dawn of one of the greatest composers, not only in film scoring, but of all time, my personal favorite film composer of all time, John Williams. We saw the beginning of his incredible career, which is still flourishing, and he is still going at it strong. And with scores like Jaws and Superman and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, you know, it was, I think that those scores still stand as a testament to the emotion and the raw nature of emotion that can really be achieved from the relationship between film and music. Those films just had so much gravity to them, especially when we started to get into his collaboration with Steven Spielberg, which of course was Jaws and Close Encounters, which would lead into their continued collaboration. But what are your thoughts on the 70s? Your favorite scores, your favorite composers of that era? What do you think?
Well, before I transition into the 70s, I mean, of course, what you just said, I wholeheartedly agree. But I think before I fully dive into the 70s, I would love to mention my personal favorite film composer ever. But no, let me rephrase. I think the most important film composer to me, who I believe is the very best, is Jerry Goldsmith. And before the 1970s, I would love to mention his start in the business. I mean, he started in the late 50s, working in some studios also as a clerk. But the score that changed a lot to me was The Planet of the Apes. Back then was so bold and so, let's say, progressive. And that back then, Jerry Goldsmith wrote such a powerful, evocative score and so many great pieces of music, which started his full scoring career. And then when you look at the 70s, I think the two biggest names of that period were Goldsmith and Williams. And Jerry Goldsmith, to me, is the one that revolutionized film music back then, because he not only was a master of melody and structure and harmony and composition, but he also, started working with the synthesizers, and he experimented a lot. And of course, John Williams being another master of melody, and his scores, you mentioned Spielberg. I think the film and the score, up until this point, that I became conscious of, that still remains one of my all-time favorites, would be Jaws.
I mean, he was just this sort of guy going on to the Universal lot, and eventually somebody asked him who the hell he was, and who was this guy sort of sitting in on all of these sessions and walking into the these big sound stages. And it was this chap named Steven Spielberg, and he would go on to revolutionize and reinvent and just be at the forefront, I think, of telling stories. And I think that John Williams' music, for me, the reason why it is so pristine and beautiful is it is like concert music, but without losing the functional aspect of a film score. So he is on every beat of every character, every movement, every landscape that you see. But he's able to bring his musicality that he had gained from all of the innovations of previous composers like Steiner, which we were talking about previously, and Korngold. So just, I think, a brilliant time in scoring was the advent of that. And Jerry Goldsmith, Alien. Wow, what a score! And the flutes with the delays and the trumpets. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Before we talk about Alien, I would love to add some comments about Jaws. Imagine a young director like Spielberg was at that time, he was experienced, alright, but he was still relatively new as a director. And to create something which would hold up for decades, it is so amazing. Steven Spielberg is probably one of the three best directors who ever lived, and also one of the most. I mean, everybody knows Steven Spielberg. I mean,
I think that when Schindler's List was made, he automatically became, in my opinion, the craft of that movie. He became my favorite director of all time. He became the best filmmaker. Just the amount of immersion and the amount of attention to story and the amount of the descriptiveness of the world in which he was creating, and the way that he was able to do something that no other art form could do, and take advantage of every aspect of film as a whole to immerse people in a certain event and to tell a story that is incredibly important to be told. I think that you know, and John Williams' score, which we'll get into when we get into the 90s, but yeah, so 1970s, amazing. What are your thoughts on Alien?
I love it. I mean, it's a score which is not that accessible outside of the picture. I think it is a brilliant score, but the backstory of that one is a little more complicated, also due to the tense relationship between Jerry Goldsmith and Ridley Scott, and then Terry Rawlings, the editor of the picture. And I think also Goldsmith said there was so much tension and so many arguments over the just say the main title, for instance, which the main title in the film is a completely different one than the one Goldsmith had originally written and conceived. He wanted to go for a, let's say, more, well, for the lack of the better term, romantic approach. He didn't want to give away the tension of the movie too early, and then the main title, which you hear in the film, is very let's say haunting and spooky, and it informs people of the events to come in that film. I mean, I think there are valid points on both sides. I mean, I think Jerry Goldsmith could have been right with his approach. I mean, the filmmaker Ridley Scott, he could have been right, you know, by saying, well, or he might have been right by saying, well, I want something different. So it's very difficult to really define who was really right and who was wrong. It was just a clash of egos to some extent, and it's really hard to define. And but what Goldsmith did for that picture, it was astounding, and it's a very, very good score and a classic, and rightfully so. And also the film, I mean, Ridley Scott, the first feature film he directed was The Duelists, and then I think Alien was he directed Alien in 1979, and he was still, like Spielberg, who we talked about previously, he was still very young and a very fresh young director. And also he, with Alien, created something that will stand the test of time.
And still going on. Well, we'll see if there's an Alien Awakening. There's still a discussion about that. But yeah, I mean, Covenant came out, a couple of years ago, and that is decades after that film originally was released. And I forget, what was it, 79, I think? 79. So it's been a journey since that film was made, and the effects still totally hold up. I mean, if you watch that movie, and it is still just as scary when you watch it now. And
that goes to show that you can create an intense movie by simply focusing on the essential ingredients. You have talented actors, you have a good filmmaking crew, great director, composer, and you focus on telling a story without relying too much on special effects. Of course, that film had special effects, obviously, but the tension you can feel the tension when you watch that movie. And to me personally, that is what filmmaking is all about. It is not about just, creating a movie with an abundance of CGI effects, just trying to impress people by saying, well, here we have $400 million, let's just waste it on CGI, and then, the audience is going to eat it up anyway,
And I think that it's such an important thing what you're saying right there, because I have seen movies that were created literally for $15 million that beat any movie that beat many movies that were created for $250 to $300 million. So, or movies that were made for $1 million. James Wan's one of his not first horror films, but the first Insidious movie, which now holds up as one of the great horror movies of the modern era, that was made for $1 million, which in film budgeting talk is a minuscule amount of money. But it's about the ideas, first of all, and that's the same thing with film music. It's about these seeds, the ideas that allow the tree to sort of sprout up. But it's also about, utilizing your resources. And the reason why a lot of these film production companies nowadays, like Blumhouse and A24, are so successful is because they create restrictions for the filmmakers. They give them a budget, and it forces the filmmakers to be creative and inventive. And that's why we have films now like Hereditary and etc., which push the boundaries. But I couldn't agree more with what you were saying. But let's make our way into the 1980s, and we'll combine that with the 1990s. But I think the great link to hook us into the 1980s would be a fella named John Carpenter, who wrote a score for this little movie that was made called Halloween, which when it was first made, nobody on that production was expecting it to go anywhere. It was this guy wearing a William Shatner mask that they turned inside out and painted white. But the movie, blew up around the world. It became this revolutionary figure in horror, like Alien was in 1979. And I think that part of that was due to the very resourceful score by John Carpenter. And the reason I say resourceful is because he literally couldn't afford a classic orchestral score. So he got a couple of synthesizers, sitting in his closet, and wrote the score, which is, I would just say, brilliantly visceral. It connects to this instinctive feel.
I love Halloween. When the film was released in 1978, it also changed the horror genre. And this is also a very prime example of what you can achieve and create with very little to no money. The budgets of the film compared to today's standards. If you have a film wrapping party, the bar tab is probably going to be bigger than the film's budget, at least for Halloween. What Carpenter did back then was so amazing, and also it's a film that takes the audience on this journey of this film horror movie, which I think is one of the best ever shot. He created a movie which was talked about for many years, and I still believe, even if they made another 10, 20,000 Halloween sequel spin-offs, it doesn't matter, because the original one by John Carpenter will always remain the very best of that series.
I totally agree, and that leads us into the 1980s/1990s. The main thing to point out here is we really underwent a very extensive technological revolution. I mean, there were extensive uses of synthesizers stemming off of what we were talking about with John Carpenter. And, while electronic film scores definitely made a rise, especially like in the classic horror/slasher genre, the symphonic music scene also had a rise with the continuation of composers like John Williams, and then, of course, Alan Silvestri. And Danny Elfman with his Batman score, and Vangelis going back to the electronic with Blade Runner, and Ennio Morricone with The Mission. I mean, there was so much richness, I think, in the 80s. And in the 90s, we look at, there were the continuation of the Spielberg John Williams relationship that led through that era. There was the onset of more sampled scores, as especially when you look at the earlier scores by composers like Hans Zimmer. We saw a new usage of synthesizers in terms of sampling, which carried into what we do now. But what are some of your favorite scores and your thoughts on the 80s and 90s?
80s, Ashton, I think, were not only synonymous with popular or huge, or let's say song-driven soundtracks that sold millions of copies, like Top Gun, for instance, of Flashdance. The 80s, to me, had it all, because the 80s featured largely symphonic scores, such as, let's say, E.T. But they also introduced a different approach of film scoring. And they relied on songs a lot. And it was also the period of time when the composers really had to struggle to get their score on the album, because if any fan observes, or if any fan looks closely, they will realize that many soundtracks that were released at that time featured 10 tracks, and on many occasions it was 8 songs and 2 score cues, or 9 songs, 1 score cue. And sometimes a score wasn't even released. Michael Kamen's Die Hard wasn't released back in 87. It came out many years later. Alan Silvestri's Predator wasn't released at that time. It came out many years later. His Back to the Future score, which was amazing. The soundtrack that was released in the 80s featured mostly songs with 2 or maybe 3 score cues by Silvestri, and then many years later Intrada released Silvestri's full score. So interesting. Also, when I talked to Harold Faltermeyer a couple of years back, he also said he really had to fight to get his Axel F theme on the soundtrack of Beverly Hills Cop. So the producers wanted hits at that time, and sometimes they completely ignored the score. And Beverly Hills Cop was one of the prime examples. 9 songs, 1 score piece. Cop 2, for instance, didn't even feature score. It was only songs. And they were so focused on finding a hit song. Or like movies, for instance, one of my personal favorite movies of all time, starring Richard Gere, was or is An Officer and a Gentleman. Jack Nietzsche scored the film, but it also had a very beautiful song performed by Joe Cocker, Jennifer Warnes, which was called Up Where We Belong. Back then, the head of the studio, or let's say production, or one of the production heads at that time, was Don Simpson, before he teamed up with Jerry Bruckheimer. And Don Simpson thought, the song, it's never going to be a hit, and just record it, do it, but I don't think it's going to be a hit. And it became a huge hit. That era, many purists, many film score purists or classical purists dismiss that era of film scoring.
The first year of the 1980s, which I can't say that I remember, I wasn't even a thought at that time, but was the classic film The Shining, which was directed by Stanley Kubrick. And that could be a whole nother episode of this podcast, just talking about Stanley Kubrick's use of music in his movies. Because I think that while I, of course, feel for Alex North, who was without any knowledge thrown off of 2001: A Space Odyssey, my gosh, does this director, Stanley Kubrick, know how to use music. He totally gets it. He gets how music has an impact on it. And if you look at a movie like The Shining, I mean, that is a great example of that. So I think that there was, Stanley Kubrick with something like The Shining and using classical music, but then there was the use of songs. If you look at a John Hughes movie like The Breakfast Club, it totally is great in that movie. I mean, these songs are wonderfully used because they bring in the reason why The Breakfast Club and John Hughes connects with so many people even now is because it connects with how we feel at that age in our lives. It connects with the high school feel. And songs are a great way of connecting with an audience because it reminds us of our past. And that was that whole thing in the 80s. And then there was the adventure scores, like, like E.T. and like Predator and all this type of stuff. So there was so much happening in the 1980s. So let's because we could talk about the 80s for a million years. And of course, Danny Elfman Batman as well, I just want to touch on. But looking at the 1990s, it is incredible the amount of, because the 1990s, while if we look at popular music, underwent a pretty major change in terms of popular music, like Nirvana and the introduction of punk. The 1990s weren't necessarily an incredibly inventive period in film music, I don't think, as much as something like the 1930s, for example. But I think that it was a very important era just in terms of the movies that were being made and therefore the scores that were accompanying those movies. Especially, like important films, I think, like I was talking about Schindler's List, but Jurassic Park and Braveheart, James Horner had this incredible onset that he was introduced in the 1980s. But really, James Horner, if you've looked at his IMDb for the 1990s, it sort of makes your mouth drop open in amazement because it's a classic score after a classic score. And you begin to wonder how. And then Hans Zimmer with The Lion King, which is one of the most iconic film scores as we know it now, which won Best Original Score at the Oscars, and a very powerful score. And,
when Danny Elfman and Hans Zimmer entered the scene, they became some of the most powerful and popular composers. And what they did at the end of the 80s, also, Elfman with his Batman and Hans with Rain Man, Black Rain, you could feel the transition to, let's say, of course, Elfman's Batman was largely orchestral, and then Hans created this amazing kind of synth sounds with Rain Man and Black Rain, and it felt almost as if it were symphonic, but still largely synthetic. And what he did with Black Rain, and then also in the 90s with Thelma and Louise and Green Card and Backdraft, for instance, in 91, he became a game changer. And the 90s, I think, stood out to me for various reasons. Not only because of Elfman and Zimmer, but also people like James Horner, who, of course, got his big break in the 80s. But how he approached music with his style was largely orchestral, but James Horner also knew how to patch in electronics.
Yep.
But still, James Horner is one of the very best composers ever. His dramatic instincts, how he scored to picture and how well it worked with the picture, it was so amazing. And listen to scores like Apollo 13, my personal favorite of that time. It was released after Apollo, but it was Braveheart. Braveheart, to me, is one of the best scores of all time. It takes the film to a whole nother level, and it goes to show how important this really is.
I think that music is really a way of looking into different aspects of ourselves, and you can see a composer really through his or her music. And I think that when you look at James Horner's music, so full of curiosity and wonder and adventure and love and passion and everything that you could imagine, I think James Horner's music encapsulated that. And that's why I'm totally not afraid to admit I cannot watch Braveheart without just sort of crying. I can't watch that movie without shedding a tear, because it so connects with the essential elements of human emotion. And I don't know if I sound pretentious saying that, but yeah, James Horner and so, but we were talking about composers like Elfman and Zimmer and that type of stuff. And I think that when you mentioned Zimmer, that really leads us into the 21st century, because the invention of sampling introduced a new way of going about writing music. Now no longer were people arriving at the scoring stage and studios sort of had to make a bid on whether the score is going to work or not and stuff like that. Now studios were asking to hear the score completely created and finished before they started recording a note with live musicians. So as early as the mid 1990s, this stuff was happening on a full scale. Movie scores were being written completely using computer samples. And that still is the way in which music is written to this day, other than a few composers like John Williams, and Ennio Morricone. So I think that really leads us into this next era of film music. But the thing I love about the 21st century is people started treating sound in general like music. So when you look at composers like Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, who I think really were at the forefront of, especially, in the year 2000, I think, 2009 with The Social Network, or when was it?
It was released in the same year as Inception and How to Train Your Dragon, so it must have been
11, I think, maybe,
or 12, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, but these guys are creating whole entire scores using modular synthesizers and patching things in and out. I mean, it's incredible, and it says something a lot about the 21st century in art in general. These things just opened up. I mean, we saw the onset of culture in general around the world. Music took this whole new approach. Art took this whole new approach, and culture took this whole new approach, which affected the way in which film was made and the way in which scores were made. And I think it's just a very powerful thing, the onset of the 21st century.
It is, and I think the technology allowed, at first it also became revolutionary in terms of how music is created, but it also allowed non-classically trained composers to showcase their talent. And I think Zimmer and Elfman being prominent examples, but I think let's say back then when they started out, I think many people still had that belief that you had to be classically trained in order to be taken seriously as a film composer.
We're really just all about telling stories. I mean, that's all we're doing with films and with music. And I think that anybody who has a story to tell, they don't need to, be filled with a whole entire book of music theory in order to be able to tell how they're feeling. You just need to be able to have a keyboard and something to say, and boom shaka boom, you have yourself a score. And in the case of stuff like A Social Network and Gone Girl and Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, stuff that Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross did, it's deeply functional stuff that really says something. And I think that's the great thing about minimalism as a whole.
You don't have to write a complex score to write a good score. I think that many people believe that if a score doesn't have or doesn't feature melody or a big orchestration, then it's not a good score. I mean, I know I know a lot of people that totally crap on this, let's say, minimalist or synthetic approach, but it's very difficult to explain. I believe that sometimes you can take a simple sequence of notes and write a very effective score. I mean, look at earlier on we talked about Jaws. I mean, the main motif is very, let's say, quote unquote simplistic. And also Steven Spielberg said in some interviews he thought that John Williams was joking. He thought he was kidding, about the motif. And then when everything, let's say, was orchestrated and performed also by John Williams, it became one of the most iconic themes and motifs in the history of film, and anybody knows that. And I believe that a good composer or a world-class composer knows exactly when to use a symphonic score, when to use a complex score, and when to be minimalist, and when to use
I think you can have a score that's literally using 3 different patches: a piano, a pad, and a bass drum, and that could be an awesome score. It might not be the best sound like music, but if it's functional in the film, the score aspect is what's the most important, because you're part of a storytelling band, you're part of a group trying to deliver a message to the audience, and as minimal as it needs to be or as grand as it needs to be in the case of something like Star Wars, which I think that we forgot to mention, which might just be the most important film score of the past 50 or so years, especially since if you ask any film composer living nowadays what their start in film music was, normally they'll say, I saw Star Wars when I was 7 years old. But I can't believe we forgot that. Dang. There's so many, but I think to wrap up our show, because I think we're going over an hour here. The history of film music is still changing and still evolving, and there's still so much to be said, and there's so many new directions we can go in. And I think already we've just seen proof that all it takes is a few people who are willing to take what has previously been done, and not to get rid of it, not to trash it, but to expand on it and to continue to try to bring in their own voices. And I think that we're still seeing that now, especially with films that are being released from all these independent film companies that hire these composers like Mika Levy and Colin Stetson, and these are truly original voices, and these people are the future of the industry. And I think that the history of film music is a brilliant thing to look at, because it's in general a great way of just seeing an evolution and seeing ways in which human beings learn from the past and continue to push forward the future. What do you think?
Very well said. And of course, we need to create new talents. We need to have new filmmakers. We need to have new editors and composers, because let's face it, our favorite artists in the world, they will not live forever, and we need to expand, evolve, or let's say, the Hans Zimmers, the James Newton Howards, the Thomas Newmans, the David Newmans, they will have to pass the torch to a new generation at some point, and then we will have to take it from there. And it is so hard. I mean, we were joking about not mentioning Star Wars extensively. It is so hard. I mean, we could go on forever tonight, but we would probably it is so important to tell a story, either as a director or as a composer, because a composer tells a musical story, and it is so gratifying to see there are still enough people out there to care about movies and about music, which is not something I would take for granted, because I feel many people just want to watch a movie in order to be entertained. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with that, but to fully appreciate the film itself and the craft and the music, that's a whole different animal. And it is so good to see that people still care.
Yeah.
Some more, some less. And I couldn't be happier.
Yeah, and I mean, especially we're seeing the newfound appreciation of people all around the world, with film music, in regards to people going to live performances around the world. You have events like the Hollywood in Vienna, which really helps to bring people together and celebrate film music. You have all these live performances that are being put on in cities all around the globe, performances of Harry Potter and Star Wars, of Jurassic Park, there's this newfound thing. And I think that, because since we're talking about the evolution of film music, you have to talk about the future. It's our responsibility to continue to appreciate and celebrate and learn from these geniuses and these masters of the past, like John Williams, and continue to bring their names through to the future and inspire new generations. So the evolution of film music is continuing at this very second, as composers around the country are writing music for the summer hits. So let's see where we go. thank you for joining us on this first episode of Score Insider. And there's going to be, more to come, and we'd love to hear from you guys what you guys think in terms of things you'd like to hear us talk about, or specific things that you'd be interested in, and we'd definitely be interested in diving into those subjects. But yeah, great talking with you, Michael.
I was really happy to have been given the opportunity to talk to you today. It was a lot of fun.
Likewise. Yeah.
And I am looking forward to many more episodes in the future.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you guys next time.